former Director of Services, MoNA, Professor Leith Dunn, Keynote Speaker, Professor Walter Kaelin, Panelists, members of the Diplomatic Corps, members of the deaf community, members of the university community, members of the media, students, and other invited guests. Good evening and welcome. I am Natasha Mortley, and I've been asked to be your moderator this evening. This evening's lecture is A Destiny of Geography, Climate Change Preparedness and Response in Caribbean Small Island Developing States. So we have an interesting evening for you with our keynote speaker and our panelists, and we look forward for a very educational and productive evening. At this time, I'd like to ask, I think Professor Gift is joining us virtually, Professor Stefan Gift to bring greetings. While our technicians get things set up. Professor Gift, can you hear us? We can't hear you, though. Could you please unmute your mic if it's muted? Because we can't hear you. Okay, if it's okay with everyone, I think I will move on while we sort out the technical problems. I'd like to call Ambassador Marcia Gilbert Roberts from the Ministry of Permanent Secretary, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. Welcome.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to you all. It's my pleasure to join you on this occasion to offer brief remarks on behalf of the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. as we explore the particular vulnerabilities of Caribbean small island developing states to the impact of climate change and their capacity to respond effectively. In recent times, we have seen that natural disasters resulting from climate change are becoming more frequent and more intense. Admittedly, they respect no borders, but there is no denying the fact that our region is fragile and among the most vulnerable in many ways, whether it be to natural disasters, economic shocks, or by virtue of the small size of the countries and their economies. For SIDS, the nexus between climate resilience and economic growth is unquestionable. In fact, climate change represents one of the greatest threats to sustainable development in our region. Its adverse effects can so easily undermine the development gains of the last decades, while threatening the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda. We therefore commend the University of the West Indies, and more specifically, the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, for partnering with the EULAC Foundation to explore this most important topic. Indeed, the work of the university has been globally recognized in the area of climate science. We express our deep appreciation also to the EULAC Foundation and other principal sponsors, being the German government and the European Union, for supporting this endeavor. Of course, I want to extend a very warm Jamaican welcome, both literally and figuratively, to Professor Kaelin. We very much look forward to your presentation, Professor, and the audience's succeeding engagement with you on practical ways to address what could be easily described as one of the most defining issues of our human survival. If you will permit me a personal anecdote, I can advise that Hurricane Gilbert, my namesake unfortunately, which represented a major national disaster for Jamaica in 1988, was my first experience of a hurricane. Like so many other young people, I listened to the initial media reports of a hurricane watch and then the hurricane warning, almost with a great sense of excited anticipation. And finally, it came. Boom, bam, shock, crackling of the lightning and the thunder and so on. The real impact had come. We were absolutely stunned into a deafening silence at daylight the next morning as we observed the magnitude of the decimation and destruction all around. Even though my family and I were minimally affected, we continue to give thanks. However, it was that personal encounter with the reality of the devastating potential of these extreme kinds of climate events that has made me able to fully understand and empathize with the suffering of our Caribbean brothers and sisters in Antigua and Barbuda and Dominica in 2017, and less than 2 weeks ago in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, where we are now offering support for the country's national reconstruction efforts. The cost of the hurricane for Antigua and Barbuda was estimated at $150 million United States dollars. For Dominica, $1.3 billion, or representing 224% of the country's GDP. And for the Bahamas, it is currently estimated at $7 billion US dollars, with only a portion of the damages estimated. In some instances, even after many decades, countries of the region are still struggling to rebuild. Jamaica's experience has been no different. Evidence of the passage of Hurricane Gilbert over 30 years ago is still evident in many locations. Each hurricane season, we wonder which of our islands may be next in line for a Category 5 hurricane, or even a level of intensity that surpasses the capacity of the instruments of measurement. We are fully aware that it is not if, but when. And the bigger question is that we seek to answer this afternoon is how do we prepare and respond effectively? For our part, Jamaica has been working across sectors to increase resilience to the impact of climate change, and I'm sure that your panelists will inform you in more detail of the actions in specific sectors such as agriculture, coastal management and water, health, urban settlements, and tourism. However, in the context of the involvement of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade in the international discourse on these issues, I can share with you some initiatives in which we have played an integral role. Given Jamaica's limited resources, the country's national mitigation and adaptation measures have been buttressed by technical and financial assistance available through North-South and South-South cooperation. The government of Japan, through 3 community-based pilot programs, assisted in mitigation efforts in the area of agriculture, water resource management, renewable energy, and energy efficiency. The government of the Republic of Korea has established a regional network for coastal erosion monitoring with specialized technical assistance from the government of Cuba. The European Union has also been supporting Jamaica's resilience building with a commitment of 16.5 million euros to the forestry sector as well as for biodiversity, particularly the development of a low-emission and climate-resilient economy. The Government of Canada has also assisted with the region in climate adaptation measures, particularly support for reconstruction and climate resilience. With the support of the government of the Federal Republic of Germany, Jamaica is amongst 3 Caribbean islands benefiting from a 4-year initiative for investment in ecosystems and the risk to disaster occasioned by climate change. And I'm sure that my colleague, Ambassador von Munchow-Pohl, will speak much more to this. The government of the United Kingdom has also provided capacity building assistance to support safe maritime trade and the development of a sustainable blue economy. I have briefly shared these examples with you to illustrate the breadth and complexity of the challenges facing SIDS and the multifaceted and multi-sectoral approaches that are needed to respond meaningfully. There is need to act, but what is still clearly missing is a sense of urgency and true commitment to deliver a decisive, multilateral, and global response. The debate is over as to the most affected countries, the Caribbean islands, a fact acknowledged by the G20 at their 2018 summit in Buenos Aires. Clearly, the solution requires behavior change from the richest countries and most developed countries, those which are most responsible for the climate crisis and who ought to commit resources for mitigation and adaptation. As we approach the Climate Action Summit being convened by the UN Secretary General in New York in just a few days' time, as well as the 25th session of the Conference of Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which will be held in Santiago in December, the kind of inquiry on which we are embarking this afternoon is certainly timely. Ladies and gentlemen, the exchanges that will emerge from the discourse this afternoon should certainly redound to our better appreciation of not only the impact of climate change, but also the imperative for action in support of Caribbean SIDS. Whether we conclude that they are vulnerable solely by virtue of their geography or merely by the fact of being a part of the global village that is now totally inundated by climate-driven phenomena of various kinds. Enjoy the lecture, listen to the roundtable presenters, and participate in the debate. I thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Gilbert Roberts. I should have said before we began that this evening's event, lecture event, is the first of a 2-part seminar series entitled Destination of Geography, Climate Change Preparedness and Response in Caribbean Small Island Development States. The event is being hosted by the University of the West Indies in collaboration with the EULAC Foundation, the Institute of Development Studies, and the Platform on Disaster Displacement. The event seeks to improve public awareness and encourage policy dialogue concerning the region's vulnerability to the adverse effects of climate change and steps to be taken to enhance the region's preparedness and responsiveness. So our technicians, are we ready for Professor Gift? Excuse me? Okay, Professor Gift, I think we're ready for you.
Speak again. Go ahead, speak.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me say good afternoon to my colleagues there at Mona and to all the distinguished guests there this afternoon. I want to first bring greetings from Vice Chancellor Hilary Beckles, who is not able to be here this afternoon. He's actually at a Global Partnerships for Climate Action at Sioux State University of New York on the very same theme. So he wishes you the best for the event this afternoon. Climate change has been described as an existential threat. Nowhere is this more true than for small island developing states, which are generally recognized to be highly vulnerable due to, among other things, limited landmass, fragile ecosystems, and high dependence on external trade. In addition, for some, since low-lying topography exacerbates threats from sea level rise, tidal action, and storm surge, as was so tragically demonstrated in the Bahamas recently. Hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017 and Dorian in 2019 demonstrate the accuracy of the projections of our climate scientists for an increase in the strength of hurricanes which will affect the region. Strong hurricanes are perhaps the most spectacular manifestation of climate variability and change. However, as a region, we also face threats to livelihoods. Decline of coral reefs will affect fisheries, while drying trends will impact agriculture, both mainstays of Caribbean economies. Tourism, another vital component of our economies, is expected to be impacted in the long term. Groundwater resources are a threat from saline intrusion as sea levels rise. The list of negatives is long, but we must be ready to grasp any opportunities which a changing climate might bring. Sterling work by our regional climate scientists, including the Climate Studies Group at MONA, makes available to us projections on which scenarios can be developed. These scenarios should guide our medium to long-term planning for the effects of climate change. In the short term, we must prepare for hurricanes and their secondary impacts, flooding, landslides, mud flows, as well as preparing for drought and heat. Medium to long-term planning will involve decisions on location of infrastructure, settlements, means of production, and ports of entry as some examples. There will be need for more drought-resistant crops and better management of water resources, including recycling of water. Technological innovation and innovative thinking will play a key role in finding solutions to difficult problems, providing an opportunity for researchers, scientists, and technologists to contribute to ensuring that the region adapts to changes which will occur. An important aspect of this will be preparing our population, particularly the next generation, to meet the challenges of climate change. The University of the West Indies has already shown leadership in this area, and through our research and teaching of courses directly related to climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. Events such as what you are putting on this afternoon are very important for broadening the climate change dialogue by involving the wider public in knowledge exchange. I congratulate the organizers of this seminar, A Destiny of Geography, Climate Change, Preparedness and Response in Caribbean Small Island Developing States, and wish you an informative and successful event. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. And it would be remiss of me to not mention and acknowledge our brothers and sisters in the Bahamas right now who have been impacted by Hurricane Dorian. I think we should perhaps have a minute of silence as we remember our brothers and sisters in the Bahamas. Thank you, everyone. You may be seated. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Gift. And we continue on with our program. I'd like to call on Stefano Shilly, the Attaché and Program Manager, Rural Development and Environment Delegation of the EU to Jamaica, Belize, the Bahamas, Turks and Caicos, and the Cayman Islands. Welcome.
Professor Stefan Gift, Ambassador Marcia Gilbert Roberts, His Excellency Dr. Bernd von Munkhoff-Pohl, Dr. Natalie Dietrich-Jones, Professor Kaelin. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to be here this afternoon at the UVI. I bring warmest greetings on behalf of the European Union and the Ambassador Vasilevska. Let me thank the University of the West Indies, in particular the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, the Federal Republic of Germany, EULAC Foundation, and the Institute of Development Studies for organizing this event and inviting us to participate. The topics to be discussed over these 2 days are of a special interest to the European Union. With the Paris Agreement on climate change agreed in 2015, the international community set out a global action plan to put the world on track to avoid dangerous climate change and limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial levels. This was a landmark achievement and a major step for international action. However, we know that there is a gap between the global ambition of the agreement and the current level of efforts. The last studies on the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius warn us about the serious and the irreversible consequences that would arise from exceeding this threshold. Yet we are ahead for much higher temperature increase. The current climate plans put forward by countries as their national determined contribution to the Paris Agreement are estimated to take us to rise between 2.7 and 3.4 degrees. According to more extreme scenarios, the risk of global warming, not calculated by the Paris Agreement, could be able to pose existential risks to human civilization. Between 2020 and 2030, the world policymakers and all of us as citizens should not lose the last chance to mobilize all the technological and economic resources available towards a single goal: to develop an economy with zero emission, to have a realistic chance of keeping global warming well below 2 degrees. The global youth movement for climate action is a sign of the growing awareness in our societies that climate change is a pressing reality today, and if we fail to act now, will increasingly affect the future of the young, their children and their grandchildren. It is time to respond to this call to action. We know we have an obligation, and we are taking action. The EU represents about 40% of all global public climate finance, and through many of our member states, and now also through the European Commission, we provide 95% of the funding for the Adaptation Fund and almost 50% of the Green Climate Fund. The European Union is quite active in the region, and from 1994 to 2018, the European Commission Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid Operations allocated 562 million euros, equivalent to 85 billion Jamaican dollars, in humanitarian aid to the Caribbean. Out of that amount, 11 billion Jamaican dollars was granted to communities to disaster preparedness. The EU is aware of the vulnerability of Jamaica and the other small island developing states to climate change that face already changing weather patterns, rising sea levels, and other long-term impacts. This year, we launched the budget support program to address environmental and climate change challenges through improved forest management in Jamaica. This is the second biggest of our bilateral cooperation in the country, with a budget of 2.5 billion Jamaican dollars. We are approving now a global climate change alliance project that will be focused to mitigate the impact of the climate change with a reach-to-reef approach. Today, we speak about geography and destiny. I will avoid fatalism. If we consider the anthropogeography and we envisage the human factor as an integrated element of our geography, I'm sure we will be able to find multiple solutions to build a sustainable future. We hope that this seminar will foster dialogue and cooperation on climate change and inspire further action to accelerate efforts to save our planet. To conclude, we mentioned the ongoing EU short film competition for young people under the theme of environmental protection. We invite all 18 to 25-year-olds Jamaicans to participate. The link is on EU website and our social media. Thank you very much.
I'd like to welcome the staff and students of the Camperdown High School. Welcome, we're happy to have you here today. Okay, moving right along, I'd like to call His Excellency von Muchenov-Pol. Did I get that correctly? Ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany. Welcome.
Professores and doctores, ladies and gentlemen. I would first of all like to thank UWI's Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for having invited me to this event, and I'm happy that Germany's dedicated financial contribution to the EULAC Foundation has helped bringing this about. The terrible devastation wreaked by Hurricane Dorian upon the islands of Abaco and Grand Bahama, and the loss of life inflicted by this tragedy are a grim reminder that the small island states of the Caribbean are among the regions most vulnerable to the effects of climate change worldwide. While we remain at the height of the hurricane season, it has re-emphasized to Caribbean governments and the general public the need to step up national disaster preparedness and response plans and to optimize regional cooperation coordination mechanisms for extreme weather events and other natural disasters. While nobody can predict where the next hurricane will strike, we do know for certain that the number and their intensity will further increase in the coming seasons with the rise of temperatures worldwide. Only the most ignorant and obstinate among us still deny the existence of anthropogenic climate change in the face of overwhelming scientific evidence and refuse to take steps to address its dramatic consequences for our planet and for our children and grandchildren. Indeed, all research findings publicized this year strongly emphasize that the need to act and to act decisively is even more urgent than previously assumed, and that applies to multilateral action within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and its annual climate summits, as well as to specific action on the ground to adapt to climate change effects, such as more violent storms, rising sea levels, and mass floodings. From the very beginnings of a binding multilateral agreement at the Rio conference, Germany has been at the forefront of fighting climate change. Even before the creation of the Green Climate Fund as the Climate Convention's main vehicle to finance mitigation and adaptation efforts worldwide, to which Germany is a major contributor, it launched its own international climate initiative in 2008 to fund climate and biodiversity projects in developing countries and emerging economies. Since this initiative's inception, the German government has steadily increased its commitments. To date, its project portfolio has reached a financial volume of some 3.3 billion euros. The more than 700 national and transnational projects funded through Germany's International Climate Initiative cover the areas of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, adapting to the impacts of climate change, preserving biological diversity, as well as natural carbon sinks, with a focus on reducing emission from deforestation and forest degradation. In the Caribbean region, the focus is not exclusively on adaptation. The latest regional project of the International Climate Initiative, which will also include Jamaica, aims to support the implementation of the Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs, which all signatories to the Paris Climate Change Accord of 2015 have agreed to commit to, by transforming the energy and transport sectors towards a low-carbon and climate-resilient future. Among the specific measures funded as part of the respective national adaptation strategies in the regions are, among others, projects to restore coastal mangrove stands and coral reefs as protective barriers against rising tides. Climate change, adaptation mitigation strategies, and disaster preparedness respond to the same root causes, though they differ, of course, in their timelines as well as in their focus. The Caribbean countries need to develop both response mechanisms simultaneously, and in both instances they depend on continued support from the international community in recognition of their particular vulnerability to the effects of climate change. After Dorian, the Bahamas qualified for a $11 million payout from the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk insurance facility, a special insurance instrument for the disaster-prone region developed under World Bank leadership and capitalized through contributions to a multi-donor trust fund, in addition to the premiums paid for the policies taken out by the region's participating governments. While the occurrence of violent tropical storms as such may be seen as part of the region's, in parentheses, geographical destiny, the amount of havoc wreaked in their path cannot. It can be significantly lessened by efficient disaster preparedness and response measures. And on the global climate front, we are called upon to take decisive action which will prevent their further increase in strength and in numbers, while there is still time left to act. But this time is now. Thank you.
I'd like to invite Dr. Natalie Dietrich-Jones, Research Fellow of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies, to introduce our keynote speaker at this time. Welcome, Natalie.
Afternoon again. I'm glad to see a full room. It means Professor Kaelin has an audience. I was very concerned he'd fly all the way from Geneva, and because of rain and other things, that the room wouldn't be occupied. But thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I'm really glad that you chose to be here. There are several things happening today, including cricket. But we're happy that you're here. So just a little bit of context before I introduce Prof. Kaelin. We met, I think it might have been last year, at the Refugee Law Initiative conference that's held at the London School of Economics. And very unassuming, but based on the way he spoke, very passionate about his work and eager for the platform on disaster displacement to have a space in the Caribbean, which is heavily affected by disasters, as we know, but on which data is not necessarily readily available. Following on that meeting, the opportunity came up when we submitted the proposal to partner with the platform on disaster displacement. And Prof. Kaelin and his colleague Atlas Solberg, without hesitation, agreed that they would partner with us. And I think it's one of the main reasons, along with the partnership with IDS, that enabled us to win the funds from the EULAC Foundation. So thank you for that eagerness. So I'll start, and in typical unassuming fashion, he sent a very short bio. So I'll read everything that's there. Professor Kaelin is Professor Emeritus for International and Swiss Constitutional Law at the University of Bern, which is in Switzerland. He is currently Envoy of the Chair of the Platform on Disaster Displacement and the former Envoy of the Chairmanship of the Nansen Initiative on Disaster-Induced Cross-Border Displacement, which he'll explain a bit more about in his presentation, and he held that post between 2012 and 2015. He served as representative of the United Nations Secretary General on the human rights of internally displaced persons between 2004 and 2010, and as a member of the UN Human Rights Committee for two periods, 2003 to 2008 and 2012 to 2014, as well as Special Rapporteur of the UN Human Rights Commission on the situation of human rights in Iraqi-occupied Kuwait, 1991-1992. From 2012 to 2015, which I think is just prior to his assuming the position as envoy, he acted as director of the Swiss Center of Excellence in Human Rights. So we're in very esteemed company, and I'm happy that he's here. Please welcome him warmly. It's his first time to Jamaica.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for the very warm welcome. I would need some technical support to get my presentation on the screen. If somebody could help me. Yeah, good. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, let me start by conveying the very warm greetings by Franz, the current chair of the platform on disaster displacement. I'm also very happy to see here the ambassador from Germany. Germany, one of the previous chairs of the platform on disaster displacement, and our key donor. The platform on disaster displacement is a group of state, or rather a state-led process focusing on improving the protection of persons displaced in the context of disasters and effects of climate change. Our steering group consists of 19 members, including the European Union, from the region Costa Rica and Mexico, the wider region, and from among the SIDS, the Maldives and Fiji. Fiji will be our next chair. What we are lacking are still a Caribbean state. So, Permanent Secretary, Ambassador, I very much would like to extend an invitation to you to join in Geneva, our steering group, because your region is an important one and an important voice, because you have so much experience of what it means to be affected by disasters, effects of climate change, and what should be done, including about one of the phenomenon, the one I want to focus on, namely human mobility, or rather displacement, in this context. I also would like, before I start with my presentation, to really thank the University of the West Indies for this very kind invitation. As Natalie just mentioned, we established that partnership. She's an esteemed member of our advisory committee, and through her, the University of the West Indies is represented in that body. And this is a great opportunity to deepen this cooperation. I would like to start with a quote from a press release by humanitarian news agencies. Many survivors have had to move. As few as 4,000 people remain on Abaco from a population of about 17,000 before the hurricane struck, according to local authorities. About 4,800 people have been evacuated from Abaco to Grand Bahama. Some survivors have made arrangements to connect with relatives and friends in the United States. At least 1,500 people arrived over the weekend in Palm Beach. A spokesperson for the UN Migration Agency, IOM, told us that no special immigration arrangements had been made with the United States or other Caribbean states. News reports said US immigration authorities had given conflicting signals about admitting Bahamians on an emergency basis. End of quote. This is what I will talk about, namely that one of the effects of disasters and adverse effects of climate change is, if I can get back to my presentation. Yeah, here we are. One of the effects is the fact that people have to move. Let me start with some facts and figures. Worldwide, on average, and that's the average of the period since 2008 till today, on average worldwide, every year, 24 million people are displaced, have to move out of their homes in the context of disasters. And the Caribbean region, as you can see on the slide, is affected too. The cumulative number for just 1 year, 2017, was 3 million. But the real concerning figures are in the column on your right. If you're looking at the percentage of people that are affected, like in Cuba, 2017, 15% of the population being displaced. St. Bartholomew, 16%, and then look at Dominica, almost half of the population. That's a worldwide record. I don't know of any other country that had such a high percentage of people who were displaced. Some parts of the world experience displacement on a very regular basis, almost every year. This is not characteristic for your region. It is calm years, and then again, hurricane strike. Or if you're going to 2010, the Haiti earthquake, disastrous. Calm periods, and then really very, very important events. What we do not hope, but we cannot exclude, that the frequency not only of disasters but of displacements will accelerate. You can see the calm period, and then 2016, 2017, 2018 was good, but 2019 didn't start well. There are also sudden onset issues that will be more a thing of the future, like sea level rise and its secondary effects, particularly coastal erosion, or stronger storm tides and salination of groundwater and the ground. And here I think it is important to see that a very large part of the Caribbeans live very close to the sea, will be affected. But it's not only the rising water, it's also the lack of water. The second quote here indicates that the Caribbean accounts for 7 out of the world's top 36 water-stressed countries. Drought. And the Caribbean, FAO told us a few years ago, is likely to experience more intense and frequent droughts. And the driver bringing me yesterday from the airport to the guest house here also referred exactly to that, the drought problem. So what can we do about it? Before I tell you what we can do about it, let me talk a little bit about how we understand, how we conceptualize disaster displacement. The media in this context very often talk about climate refugees. This is not a notion we use. And it's a notion that is avoided also more and more in the international discussion. Why? Of course, like refugees, these people have to flee. Most of those displaced remain within their own country. Many can go back after relatively short periods of time. But large numbers may remain in protracted displacement, protracted internal displacement for very long periods of times. In Ethiopia, Kenya, we still have about 300,000 people who were displaced across the border during the 2011-2012 famine in Ethiopia, and more than 1 million internally displaced at that time. And refugees, yes, they flee to other countries, and sometimes people affected by disasters go to other countries, as my quote just indicated. But they should not be called refugees, because in international law, refugees are people who have to leave their countries because their government turns against them, or a de facto power holder, such as an insurgent group. Certainly the government of the Bahamas is not turning against its own people. Quite to the contrary, it tries to do everything possible to help them. So conceptually, there is a huge difference between refugees as defined by international law and people who are displaced in a disaster situation. But disaster displacement is a complex concept. What the Nansen Initiative, the precursor of the Platform on Disaster Displacement, in a series of consultations which led to the Nansen Initiative Protection Agenda, which was supported in 2015 by 110 states attending a global consultation, including some of the Caribbean countries. What came out of that consultation is it's not the hurricane, not the earthquake that is displacing people. There is no such thing as a natural disaster. It's the human factors. So the UN defines a disaster as a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society due to the hazardous events interacting with conditions of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity, leading to human, material, economic, and environmental losses and impacts. Or to put it into simpler terms, we are confronting a disaster when a society or even a whole country is no longer able to cope with the impact of a hazard, with the damages caused by the hazard. And when we're talking about disaster displacement, we assume that it is the consequences of the natural forces, the disaster that force people to leave. So disaster displacement are situations when people are forced or sometimes obliged to leave their homes or places of habitual residence as a result of a disaster. And this can occur within a country or across borders. It can be spontaneous flight, it can be an ordered and enforced evacuation, it can be planned relocation. So our notion is not a narrow one, but the key factor is lack of real choice, no voluntariness. If we go further and ask ourselves, why are people displaced in the context of climate change, then the assumption that climate change automatically leads to displacement, to flight, certainly is not accurate. We have impacts of climate change all over the world, and not everywhere people have to leave their homes. In fact, displacement is always multi-causal. There are the environmental drivers, the natural hazards. There are demographic drivers, population density, sometimes the age structure. There are economic, social drivers, poverty, lack of resilience, but also political drivers, weak governance, or sometimes, not in this region, but in some other parts of the world, a state-supported or even state-driven policy of discrimination. So, what can be done? Before I answer this question, again, let's think a little bit, when do people have to move? I think this picture, even though it's not about people, it's a house, indicates quite well when people are displaced. There's a natural hazard. Here, too much rain, a landslide. The house was on top of this very steep hill, so it was exposed to that hazard, the landslide. And as you can see, it didn't have good foundations. It was too vulnerable, and the whole house was displaced. And the same is true for people. People have to move if they are exposed to a hazard and too weak, too vulnerable to resist. This provides us with great openings for action, because we can try to reduce the hazard, we can try to reduce exposure, and we can try to reduce vulnerability. Reducing the hazard in the context of climate change, of course, is climate change mitigation, reduction of greenhouse gases, full implementation of the Paris Agreement. Reducing exposure is helping people to move out of harm's way before the disaster strikes. This can be planned relocation within countries, and I read that Jamaica already had to relocate a few villages. And it can be opening migration channels for regular migration, not irregular, regular migration to other countries as an adaptation possibility. And vulnerability can be reduced through climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and resilience building measures. If we would fully implement the Sustainable Development Goals, then we would substantially reduce vulnerability. Still, not everyone can escape displacement. So we need to protect those who are displaced internally and displaced across borders. So our message really is we have to help people to stay, we have to help people to move out of harm's way, and we have to help people to be protected once they are displaced internally or across borders. That's the toolbox. And we need to use this toolbox. So to invest into disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, into opening up regular migration pathways, planned relocation, and invest into protection. What are practical steps to do that? We have made at the international level huge progress in conceptualizing these issues. We have been able, I think, at the international level, not to really work across all the silos, but at least to reduce a little bit these strong borders between silos. But then all of that international work, and I will come back to the different steps that have been taken, are particularly important for your region because you are facing specific challenges. I don't want to go into all of this. It has been mentioned previously by the different speakers, the vulnerabilities. But still, what Natalie Dietrich-Jones said at the conference recently in Trinidad, I think is very important. The interconnectivity between the small size, small populations, reduced state capacity because of the small size of territories of population, and then the geography, the particular exposure to the vulnerability. So even though Caribbean states are in a difficult situation, much can be done. We can and should invest in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. Here we have, for instance, the send-down framework on disaster risk reduction. We have the Global Compact for Migration, and both documents integrate human mobility and very clearly send out that message. We do have to integrate displacement risks, human mobility into disaster risk reduction plans and strategies. We have to do the same with regard to climate change adaptation plans and strategies. And this means for your countries really integration of displacement risks into national disaster risk reduction and climate change strategies. We recently made a mapping and we have seen that still a rather small number of states really do that when they develop their disaster risk reduction strategies. Integration of human mobility issues into the work of the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center would be one very practical step. Development of a joint analysis by the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, CEDEMA. We're working together with them. And again, the CCCCC, the 5 Cs, the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. And again, specifically looking at where do we have particular displacement risks, what can we do about them, how should we invest, what are the best steps, for instance, in terms of disaster risk reduction. Planned relocation is another option. It should be a measure of last resort because we know planned relocation are usually very, very challenging. Nice houses are built, services are provided, but the big issue with planned relocation in most countries I've seen is livelihoods, restoration of livelihoods. But there are possibilities. Again, at the international level, UNHCR, together with Georgetown University Brookings, has developed, I think, very good guidance on how to do planned relocation in the context of disasters and climate change. And Fiji, for instance, and other states, has, building on that, just adopted a national planned relocation strategy. With different elements, you need a good legal framework. You need very much to consult with people. They have to participate in the endeavors. You have to look at the housing, land, and property issues, and very much livelihood issues, etc. We can find and need to find solutions for internally displaced persons, which was a very big challenge in Haiti after the 2010 earthquake. Some people still live in internal displacement. And durable solutions for internally displaced people means not always return. Sometimes it's not possible because land has been washed away or disappeared in a landslide, or it's too dangerous. It can be local integration at the place where they had been displaced to, or relocation to another part of the country. It has to be, again, a matter of choice, a matter of people participating in their solutions. And again, it has to be holistic. Of course, providing physical safety. You are not internally displaced people sending back or relocating to a place that, again, is at high risk of disasters. Material safety, the livelihoods, the housing, the basic services. Sometimes it's also an issue of legal safety, documentation. Newborn babies in Haiti for a long time were not registered, so they risked to become de facto stateless persons, as one example here. Facilitating migration, voluntary migration, is another issue, opening migration pathways. Again, the Global Compact on Migration in Objective 5 addresses this issue with specific reference to sudden onset disasters and long-term effects of climate change. Right now, in the Caribbean region, our analysis showed that there are only very limited migration pathways for people affected by disasters, adverse effects of climate change. And you have heard the quote, IOM saying the same thing. But there are, again, possibilities. Like, for instance, you have the free movement agreements, the CARICOM one, the OECS one. They were made for economic purposes. But we have seen in West Africa, we now see in Eastern Africa. We have seen it, for instance, after the Christchurch earthquake in New Zealand, with regard to Australia, that disaster-affected people can profit from free movement of persons agreements if the hurdles, for instance, regarding documentation, regarding showing that the motivation is just economically, are removed. So I think it's an interesting perspective to look at the practice of these free movement of persons agreement. And then national migration laws can do a lot. If you're looking at your neighboring Central American region, all these countries have instruments such as humanitarian visa, or they have instruments such as temporary protection, and they are using that in disaster situations. Our analysis of the Caribbean region showed that there is very limited legislation along these lines. Again, this is something that could be looked at. And it's something that is being looked at. We have been engaging with the Caribbean Migration Consultations, the CMC. It's in the process of being established. I think it will be in November, launched as a Caribbean process. And there, the work is starting on developing and hopefully then implementing a plan of action of human mobility in the context of disasters and climate change, really looking at the migration issues. This is building on something, again, we did in Central America and then also South America, developing a guide to effective practices with a view to harmonizing simply domestic laws on the basis of reciprocity. Each of your islands can be hit, so it might be in the interest of your populations to be admitted to a neighboring island, but also vice versa, to be ready to accept people. So lots of things can be done, practical things. What we need is the political will at the regional level, the political will at the international level, and the support by the international community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kaelin. So we're going to move directly to our roundtable, so I will invite our panelists to have a seat on our sofas in the front here. But while our panelists get organized, I'm going to take 2 questions from the floor for Professor Kaelin. Anybody? Okay. Mike.
To turn it on.
My name is Patrick Williams, and good evening. And how you would look at spirituality, organization, with the geography and technology today. When I say spirituality, to my knowledge, is Mother Nature. It's like a direct beam. And when you look on like nuclear manufacture and explosion, it's an heavy weight onto a human being feeling. So I asked how you would feel a nuclear manufacture, the power and explosion.
Thank you very much for raising the issue of spirituality, because I do think that spirituality is part of resilience, that it helps people to deal with these challenges that are connected to climate change. But also, I think that spirituality can contribute to more adequate behavior, because climate change is man-made. Climate change is a consequence of, as you termed it, not taking seriously Mother Nature. So thank you very much for your intervention.
And maybe just one more question, okay?
Professor, good afternoon. My name is Lancer Bloomfield. Your presentation, I really welcome it. But I want to ask a very serious question. In the 1970s, Jamaica, along with the US and several other countries, when we were experiencing massive drought, they did what is called cloud seeding. When you have terrible weather systems that can wreak such havoc on the Bahamas and other islands and places in the US, is it beyond our capacity and that of our scientists to see those clouds out at sea before they make landfall and become the kind of disaster which we are now experiencing?
I'm not a scientist. As I said, I'm a lawyer. But I do think that, again, it's very much a question of political will or absence of political will, that we invest into the early warning systems, into taking the signs at the horizon seriously. We cannot avoid everything, but we can at least mitigate what is in front of us. And this is what we must try.
Thank you, Ron.
Okay, thank you. We will move on, and if you have any other questions, we will have an opportunity to take more questions at the end of the panel, the round table. Our panelists today, this evening, are a diverse group of experts, and I'm going to ask them to speak in the order in which they appear on the program. Each panelist will have 8 minutes, and I'll let you know when you have 2 minutes remaining to present. And at the end of all the presentations, we will open up the floor for questions and answers. So the first panelist is, and I will just briefly introduce them, Mr. Terry Cannon, who is a senior fellow at the Institute of Development Studies. He teaches in the MSc program, Climate Change, Development and Policy. He has been teaching and doing research in development studies for many years, and until 2008 was a reader in development studies at the University of Greenwich and principal scientist at the Natural Resources Institute at the University of Greenwich. Dr. Leith Dunn is the head of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, MONA Campus Unit. She's a graduate of the University of the West Indies. She has a BA honors degree in languages and social sciences, an MSc in sociology, and a PhD in sociology from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Senator Dr. Floyd Morris is the director of the UE Center for Disability Studies. He has been in that post since 2009. Dr. Morris holds a bachelor's degree in mass communications, both an MPhil and PhD in government from the University of the West Indies, MONA. He's an advocate for persons with disabilities, and he has done extensive research on persons with disabilities in Jamaica and the Caribbean. Our next panelist is Dr. Tanisha Stevenson, who is the head of the Department of Physics, Faculty of Science and Technology at UE. She's a senior lecturer in the Department of Physics and a researcher with the Climate Studies Group MONA, with an interest in Caribbean climate variability and change and climate extremes. And finally, we have Ms.Jhannel Tomlinson, who's a PhD candidate in community-based adaptation and climate change. She's a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography and Geology, and her research seeks to assess the capacity of community-based organizations to effectively support current and future climate change adaptation initiatives. So help me welcome our panelists. And we will begin with, I think the microphone, Natalie has the mic. So we will begin with Terry Cannon, and then we move on to Dr. Dunn. So panelists, keep an eye on me as I will be your timekeeper.
Thank you very much. It's also my first visit to Jamaica. Why I've left it so long? Because I'm having a good time. And it's such a beautiful campus, so it's a great shame I've not been here before, but I do hope to come again, because my presence here and the other event we're having today and tomorrow under the Destiny of Geography banner is the first event of a memorandum of understanding between my institute, the Institute of Development Studies in Britain, and UE Studies, and we're looking to really make that a much more concrete relationship by finding collaborations in teaching and in research projects where we join together to do that. So I'm looking forward to that. And I also bring greetings from Melissa Leach, who is the director of the Institute of Development Studies, and she's extremely happy that we are getting this partnership going and that this event is happening as part of that relationship. So I'm very grateful for that. Having said that, I'm now going to say something which is in relation to the topic. And I'm going to start, and I'm very sorry, Ambassador Gilbert Roberts, I won't be able to quote you directly, but you said something along the lines of there is a need for behavior change by rich countries. Okay? So that's my theme. And we've had several talks by people of diplomats. Now, diplomats, ambassadors are amongst the people in the world I feel most sorry for a number of reasons. The first is they may have very different views themselves personally from those of the governments that they have to represent. Now, that is less the case for the United States because the ambassadors change with the government. But for British ambassadors, they stay in post no matter what the government is, and I feel deep embarrassment for what the British ambassadors around the world are having to do in relation to what is going on in Britain at the moment. So I have every sympathy for that, and I also think that diplomacy is an absolutely crucial set of practices in international relations, as we've seen because of my governments and the United States government, where all kinds of diplomatic relations are broken or damaged. We know that it is important. However, having said that, I would be not being fair to the young people who are on strike again tomorrow all around the world on the climate crisis. I would not be fair to them if I pretended that diplomacy is going to solve this problem. We need some ground truths, and we need to speak truth to power, as people say. And so the first thing to say is that the global system of international politics and economics is not fit for purpose for dealing with the climate crisis. And that is because the rich countries have to engage in massive behavior change. We're surrounded here in the Caribbean by a number of British-controlled territories, which are in effect corruption vehicles for global finance, from dictators, from criminals, and from corporations that don't want to pay a fair share of tax. Now, it's estimated that there's around $21 trillion holed up in these so-called tax havens. And these are managed in such a way as to create the wealth and maintain the wealth of the 1% of the world's population who control half of the world's entire wealth. This is why the system is not conducive to us dealing with the climate crisis. If we have a system that operates to protect that and not remedy it, we do not have the basis on which we can deal with the climate crisis and the problems of disasters. That's just a very, very simple statement of the truth. Okay, a system that maintains that way of behaving in the world, that maintains such gross inequality, is not going to solve get anywhere near solving the climate crisis. And I have developed a kind of a tool for thinking about this, and I call it the cure to damage ratio. So I think about how much money is being allocated to solve problems in the world, development problems, the climate problems of the world, and how much money is being spent by governments in the private sector to make that problem worse. That ratio, on the few examples I've managed to look at the moment, is around 1 to 1,000. In other words, 1,000 times more money is spent to make the problem worse than is being used to help solve the problem. And that's even if we accept that the money is being spent in a good way. To give you a concrete example, Ambassador mentioned Canada and gratitude for assistance coming from Canada. Canada may be giving aid in a useful way, as do other rich countries, but Canada is enabling the digging up of the oil tar sands in the middle of the country, which is a major polluter. They are digging, making pipelines to be able to export that oil. That should be left in the ground. Australia is allowing India to develop a huge mine in the north of Australia, which the UNESCO threatened to delist the Great Barrier Reef because of the damage that is going to be done to it as they export the coal. This is a massive mine which is costing $19 billion. Think about that in terms of what money is being allocated for the world to clean up climate change, let alone other forms of pollution. And the killer one, how am I for time? 2 minutes left? Right. So another one of these cure to damage ratios I came across in a research project about 5 years ago. We were looking at the fisheries problems of Ghana. Now Ghana has just started, a few years ago, started extracting oil, which should also be left in the ground. And we have the curious situation where lots of developing countries which have discovered they've got oil and gas are now digging it up. So the World Bank is giving loans to Mozambique to dig up oil and gas. It should not be doing that. Uganda is digging up oil. Ghana is developing oil. Now we went to look at the fisheries problem there, and the main climate change threat to the fisheries of the poor fishers who fish in the coastal waters is the disruption of the ocean currents. There's not much sign yet that that is happening. But in the process of doing this research, we found that the main problem for their fisheries is not anything to do with climate change. It is the fact that factory fishing is coming in from countries from the Far East and the European Union. And the European fish companies are subsidized under the common fisheries policy of the European Union to take fish away from African countries where poor people are struggling to be able to land catches that enable their families to survive. Now, in recompense for the damage being done, a few years ago the European Union gave Ghana €1 million to build a freezer unit which would help them to smooth out supply chains for the fish that was landed by the small fisher people. The common fisheries policies is in the order of billions of dollars. So we have billions of dollars being used to rip off the fisheries of those African countries compared to €1 million given to Ghana to help do it. And the last one I've left because I know some of you might be thinking now I'm sounding like a raving radical revolutionary. So now I'm going to give you some figures from the World Bank and the IMF. So this is the killer cure to damage ratio. Because 5 years ago, the GEF, the Global Environment Fund of the Bank, and the IMF calculated how much governments are giving as subsidies to policies which cause climate change, how much they're giving compared to how much is going to help countries deal with climate change. Now, the latter figure, hardly anything is going at the moment. In the Paris Agreement, $100 billion a year was allocated for, I'm nearly finished, $100 billion was said would be allocated, but this is all voluntary. This is to help countries, poor countries, to deal with climate change impacts. $100 billion, it may never happen because it's voluntary. Okay, so we have a great agreement that any money flow is voluntary. At the same time, how much do rich countries spend on making climate change worse? It is of the order of $5 trillion a year. $5 trillion a year is making it worse. And this is through subsidies, which are encouraging people to burn fossil fuels. The British government in the last 5 years has allocated nearly £500 million to help export. These are export subsidies for companies which are exporting coal mining technology to other countries. So they're giving money, free money, to British companies to help them export things which will enable other countries to dig up coal, which will damage the entire world. And so we have this extraordinary business, which is why diplomacy and talking about the small amounts of money that are given to help poor countries deal with climate change are not worth talking about compared to the trillions of dollars which are within the system that make climate change worse. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm sure that my colleagues will agree that I can stay here. There are some things that I want to show you. My name is Leith Dunn. I'm head of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies. And what I want to do today is to explain what is gender, why it is important to the topic that we're looking at, which is climate change and disasters, to share with you a bit of what we have been doing and how you can help. And I'm appealing particularly to the young people who are here, who are thinking of careers in gender and other areas, because we desperately need support to integrate gender in climate change and disaster risk management. So gender is different from sex. One is learned, one is biological, and we have the program at the Institute, which is we have teaching, research, and outreach that we do. In our teaching program, we developed a course on gender, climate change, and disaster risk management, which we have taught successfully for maybe 5-7 years. Why is that important? It's not just about passing a course, but building awareness of how gender differentials, about how the way in which you're socialized can in fact affect vulnerability and risk. So we use gender as a cross-cutting issue to look at class differences, disability, age differences, and so on. We've partnered with several institutions in looking at how gender can influence vulnerability and risk of disasters. And part of it is ensuring that in preparing for a disaster, you look at who is vulnerable and how. And for us, gender is not women. We look at how men and women and males and females of different ages are. So we think of children. If you're going to have to prepare for disaster, you need to think about how the boys and girls are going to be prepared so they don't die or be damaged. We think of adolescents, boys and girls, what are differential risks, and also adults and the elderly. And now I stress the elderly too because we're going through a demographic transition. We're living 20 years longer, and the disasters that we're seeing around us, the hazards, mean that if we do not have policies and programs in place to assist persons who are very young or very old, we're going to have a major problem. So here are some of the things we have done. We have worked with the SEDEMA, Disaster Emergency Management Agency, to integrate gender in their disaster risk management tools, their needs assessments, training trainers and policymakers. And I have Indy McClymont-Lafayette here, who is one of our partners. We help them to understand the vulnerabilities before a disaster, how to survive, and how you can support post-disaster recovery. We've worked with ACDI VOCA with USAID to build awareness of gender and climate change adaptation with farmers. Similarly, we have partnered with the Climate Change Adaptation Fund of the Planning Institute to build capacity about their climate change focal points, about how you integrate gender perspectives. We have worked with the Commonwealth Secretariat, the Commonwealth Foundation in doing training to build that awareness. We have produced several tools for the EKA-CDM project, which is funded by Canada through the Institute for Sustainable Development and Disaster Risk Reduction Center right here at the university. Now it means that we have materials, we have publications, we have curricula that can in fact train trainers, both at the undergraduate and postgraduate level. We have worked also with other institutions looking at how you can mitigate disasters. So what are some of the risks for males? When we think about our gender roles and relations, the expectation is that men are going to be saving us, right? If you're going to batten down your house, it's a man that has to do that. It means that men are going to be vulnerable to falling or what have you. When we saw the floods the other day, we saw a lot of persons out trying to be rescued. Now, males are going to be more at risk of leptospirosis because they're walking around in dirty water trying to rescue people, right? So those are some of the issues that we raise and build awareness of in terms of mitigating disasters. For females, we look at the fact that gender-based violence is a major issue that we grapple with every day. So if you have to move into a shelter, how do we plan our shelters to be more gender sensitive and ensure that you do not end up with more rapes or HIV infections as a result of that? Similarly, working with the health sector, how do we ensure that you do not increase your maternal mortality rates because you have not taken, made preparations for women who are pregnant and may go into labor? Those are some of the practical things. And also in terms of how disasters impact sectors, economic sectors. We look, for example, at the tourism sector. We did a tool on how you integrate gender in disaster risk management for the tourism sector, looking at who does what in the tourism sector. Similarly, for agriculture, we look at fishing, agriculture in terms of plants and so on. We look at caregivers in the health sector, but we also look at how we can improve our housing stock so that we do not have deaths and destruction. What do we want you to do? We want you to recognize that we have ratified a number of conventions at the international level. The CEDAW Convention, the Women's Rights Convention. We also, in the Caribbean, or certainly here in Jamaica, have a national policy for gender equality, which means that we have to integrate gender into all programs and policies. And we try and build awareness. There are gender focal points that have been appointed in various institutions. So what we're doing at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies here at MONA is building awareness of the importance of why you have to mainstream gender, why you have to collect data disaggregated by sex and other factors, so your analysis is going to help you to target the problem and the solution. Thank you very much. We have some publications online. This is a publication that was done by us with papers from students from the Gender, Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management course, looking at several of those issues. But I also wanted to alert you to Men and Masculinities, edited by Elaine Enerson and Bob Pease. It is a companion piece for women and disasters that they did, and I have a chapter here looking at the vulnerability of men. So we look at both sexes and look at the vulnerabilities and risks across different ages as well. Thank you.
It's always a pleasure to be in a forum such as this to participate in an important topic that affects all our citizens. I want to acknowledge all the members of the diplomatic corps, the members of the panel, and our distinguished lecturer and visiting guests. Some time ago, one of our noted reggae artists and icon, Rita Marley, did a song which says, when the rain falls, it doesn't fall on one man's housetop. And I want to add to that, that when the breeze blows, it touches everybody. And I start there because when we speak of climate change and the consequences thereof, it has implications for everybody, including one of the groups that I have seen it fit to advocate for over the years, persons with disabilities. Persons with disabilities constitute one of the most vulnerable groups within any society. So if you're talking about climate change and its effect on population, you have to start by looking at some of the most vulnerable groups within your society. And most definitely, persons with disabilities must be included in that grouping. Now, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that have become the
Bible, so to speak, for issues relating to persons with disabilities globally, defines a person with a disability as an individual with a long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairment which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full or effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. And certainly, there are a whole lot of barriers in Jamaica, the Caribbean, and the broader global space that is impacting on the lives of persons with disabilities. You see, a blind person is not going to build or construct a sidewalk with light poles in the middle of it. A blind person is not going to build a bridge without rails. A person who has a physical disability is not going to build sidewalks that don't have ramps so that they can move around easily with their wheelchair. And a deaf person is certainly not going to be a part of a newscast team that does not have closed caption or sign language to disseminate information. And so, there are a whole lot of barriers that are placed in the pathways of persons with disabilities, thus restricting their capacity to perform and to function normally in society. And that increases the vulnerability of persons with disabilities. Now, the said United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Article 11, which speaks to the situation of risk and humanitarian emergencies, speaks clearly about how persons with disabilities ought to be treated in situations of risk. And they ought to be given priority attention by state parties. Now, when you look at the countries that have signed and ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, we have over 180 countries that have signed the convention, over 177 countries that have signed and ratified. So a significant portion of the countries across the world are duty bound to honor the provisions of these conventions. But yet still, we are not seeing the sort of effort to ensure that in the case of climate change and its consequences, persons with disabilities are protected. And so, I want to point to some things that ought to be done in order to deal with the issue of persons with disabilities in the context of climate change. We have to make sure that we strengthen and improve legislation right across the Caribbean to protect the rights of persons with disabilities and to ensure that all the systems and procedures by governments are inclusive of persons with disabilities and make provision for them when it comes onto natural disasters. We have to make sure that we strengthen the education system to build the capacity of persons with disabilities so that they can become a part of the productive capacity of countries so that they can be employed and they can take care of themselves rather than depend on the state for any sort of welfare assistance. We have to make sure that we build the capacity of persons with disabilities to ensure that they have access to information. All systems must be put in place to ensure that persons with disabilities, including those who are deaf, to access information. You don't want natural disasters to be taking place And members of the deaf population, for example, don't know what is taking place because the newscast is not inclusive to their needs. We have to make sure that we provide these individuals with support through modern technology, because modern technology is what is going to build the gap and break the barriers that exist between persons with disabilities. And finally, I'm going to make a case for reparation, because the truth is a lot of our social institutions, our churches, our educational institutions, our health facilities came out of a historical context based on our colonial experience. And a lot of these institutions never took into consideration the needs of persons with disabilities, because we were socialized then that persons with disabilities they are handicaps, they should be confined to their home, they have no place in the broader society. And that is a colonial legacy. But we have done nothing to change that colonial legacy. But it makes a potent case for us to lay a strong claim to those who were our colonizers, to make sure that they assist in the transformation of the Caribbean space, to make it more inclusive and responsive to persons with disabilities, so they can deal with the rigors of climate change. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, my colleagues have taken to standing up, so I have to now stand as well. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon.
We want to thank the presenter and organizers of this forum, because the presentation reminds us of an overlooked area with respect to the impacts of climate change, that of displacement. As noted by the keynote, our Caribbean has an inherent sensitivity to climate. We have a reliance on water, agriculture, tourism, a number of sectors that are heavily reliant and linked to climate. We have a sensitivity given our sizes, given the location of our populations, given the location of our economic activities. All these have contributed to the vulnerabilities that we experience today. Climate change, as we see, has brought a new climate era with the emergence of a new normal, such as more intense storms, longer and drier spells, more variable rainfall, increased temperatures, rising sea levels. Many of these are recurrent in nature, and they're all cumulative in their impact. This new climate era is impacting the quality of lives and the standard of living, particularly for small island developing states like the Caribbean. And from the speaker today, we see again that it's prompting perhaps a new kind of paradigm in what we see happening with displacement. So displacement dynamics and considerations. For example, the acceleration of displacement, as was noted today. And we just have to look at Hurricane Dorian to have that picture in our mind. Importantly as well, the science suggests that the climate will continue to change. So a warmer and dry Caribbean, even with variable rainfall, greater intensity of storms, higher sea levels, more frequent rainfall and temperature extremes. We now have the science of attribution, which continues to mature globally and points more clearly to the human influence on the climate system. Our science continues to strengthen our ability and the ability of our negotiators to characterize loss and damage, and I'm sure there is a place for displacement in that dialogue. Our science suggests we have new vulnerable groups emerging. So the presentation today accurately identifies a necessary response and some necessary responses to reducing displacement risks in the face of a changing climate. One being climate change mitigation, that is, addressing the causes of a change in climate by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So efforts to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels and improve our energy efficiencies and improve land use management are some urgent mandates of countries within the Caribbean for our own viability and to contribute to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. A second response that we have been reminded of is adaptation, so positioning ourselves to cope with a new climate era that has emerged, and doing so by building this resilience across multiple sectors and using that multi-sector approach to decrease flood and coastal inundation risks, improve food security, diversify livelihoods, and as the speaker pointed to today, allowing for integration of displacement risks into risk reduction strategies within the region. This forum in itself points to a third response, education, as Senator just spoke to. As climate change continues to be a part of our lived experience, it's important as a Caribbean that we have a population who understands what climate change is, what it means for how we live, and how we will necessarily have to respond. And in the context of today's discussion, respond to reduce displacement risks, or to create that framework that will enable seamless displacement among Caribbean nationals, whether by planned relocation or migration, all towards preserving lives. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, our achievement of our development goals regionally and nationally as embodied in Vision 2030 hinge on us factoring climate variability and climate change in planning and policy. There is a necessary place for the science in building resilience within the region.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I guess we left the youngest for last. So firstly, on the theme for this afternoon, where we speak about disaster preparedness and response, particularly in small island states, I'd just like to use this opportunity to speak about my experience working with two groups who in the literature are considered vulnerable, young people and rural populations. So my research looks specifically at community-based adaptation and looking at how farmers have collectively been working to reduce the impacts that they have seen. And three things jump out at me based on the findings of my research. Firstly, the farmers are most susceptible to the impacts of drought, particularly increasing intensity and duration of droughts, and of course hurricanes. And for them, the idea of preparedness, they see where they are more able to prepare for some in response to others. So for them, it's easier to prepare for a drought rather than a hurricane. So it's easy to implement irrigation infrastructure. It's easy to get a drum, to get a tank, to implement water storage facilities, because they are aware that these are the kind of things that they need to do to ensure that they have water to tend to their crops. On the contrary, for a hurricane where a Category 5, you are unable to predict what the impacts might be, they see where such a hazard, where such an event is particularly hard to prepare for. As a result, we see where there is some vulnerability or increased vulnerability when you compare the impacts of droughts to the impacts of hurricanes. One of the other things we've realized as well is that where individuals have a lack of access to resources, preparedness, adaptation, all these different buzzwords that we use every day is not as important to them because they have more short-term things that they have to contend with. In a single-parent household where you have 3 children to send to school, you realize that sending the kids to school, buying food, ensuring that you have inputs for the farm are more important than implementing an irrigation structure, for example. So again, we see where those who are resource poor are also more vulnerable when you compare them to other persons who have more resources at their disposal. And this idea of climate apartheid, where we see persons with access to resources being more capable of adapting, is something that we see increasingly among rural populations as well. Now, The Jamaican Climate Policy Framework has, of course, made efforts to mainstream climate change into their local initiatives and projects, particularly through the Japan Climate Change partnerships. We see it through ACDI VOCA, as was mentioned earlier, the GOJ Adaptation Fund, all these different things being implemented on the ground in these farming communities to say, okay, we realize that there's a need to help these individuals to heighten their adaptive capacities. And again, we laud their efforts. However, again, as mentioned before, preparedness is still an issue, particularly where these extreme events are concerned. How do we then seek to increase their capacity to adapt to these events? Now, in his keynote, Professor Kaelin spoke to two things which I'd like to comment on. He spoke about planned location as one of the strategies, and while this is something critical, there will be arguments surrounding how do we encourage persons who have this sense of place and a sense of identity to leave the space that they've come to call home because it's not being affected. How do we get persons such as the Maroons who have a cultural heritage and a sense of attachment to their home to leave just because they're being threatened? We see it happening in Jamaica now, where a lot of times places come under threat and persons resort back to the spaces because, again, this is my home, these are my resources. It's very hard to get people to leave behind something that they're so attached to. So we have to make sure that in looking at planned adaptation, we implement strategies. We take into consideration the fact that they have an attachment to this space. It's very difficult for them to just get up and leave the space. And one of the things I've heard in conversations is that it's not just a place to live, but a place where you can continue to have a livelihood, have something that you can continue to support your family through. The second group of persons, the youth, I'm very passionate about youth activism, particularly where climate change is concerned. I work with a lot of young people, particularly in rural Jamaica, because we realize, again, that they are most at risk. Their parents depend on the environment for their sustenance, so we have to ensure that they are given a space to have their voices heard. I leave tomorrow for the Youth Climate Action Summit in New York and for the Climate Action Summit on Monday, which I'll be actively participating in. And I see these as platforms, again, for the young people to collaborate, to share our experiences, to share what has been happening in our individual countries, how we can collaborate. Again, our primary medium or primary platform is through awareness, is through sharing information and disseminating information and ensuring that the authorities or the powers that be are aware that we're going to inherit a world that we pretty much contributed little to nothing to, and we have to ensure that our collective voices are heard if we are to live in a space where we can have a future. And as Vision 2030 speaks about Jamaica being the place to live, work, raise families, and do business, if climate change threatens the sustainability of that, then what is Jamaica that we have to inherit? So again, as young people, as vulnerable populations, we have to ensure that there's inclusive spaces, that there are inclusive spaces for us to work in, that whatever platforms, whatever initiatives and programs are being developed, it's inclusive and give us this space where we can have our voices heard, where we can share experiences and ensure that there is increased communication, collaboration, and cohesion. Thank you so much.
Thank you to all our panelists. Very passionate presentations, very informative. I'm going to open up the floor now for questions or comments. Perhaps another 15 minutes of question and answers. I will take 2 questions at a time and allow the panelists to respond. Is that a question in the middle? Yes, okay. Could you ensure that the mic is on? Yes, thank you.
Okay, so I'm Adrian Watson. My question to the panel really is, given that there are a lot of around pairing conservation and ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction methodologies, I'm not hearing much about how those particular mechanisms play a role in protecting local communities and local lives, and also especially with regards to displaced persons. For example, I was speaking to Mr. Terry Cannon this morning, and we're talking about relocating people like from the coast to inland. And remember, these persons would have built their lives around a particular ecosystem. For example, fisher folks on the coast versus someone who lives in a mountain that plants. And so, of course, if you relocate a fisherman in the mountains, he might not necessarily know what to do.
Thanks for your question, Adrian. As I had mentioned before, if we are to utilize planned adaptation as an adaptation strategy, we need to ensure that we give consideration to persons and their livelihoods. So it's particularly difficult for you to look as a fisher, and I have a colleague here who works with fisheries, and one of the things we talk about a lot is how difficult it is to come up with alternative adaptation strategies when you live in a space where you continue to do this, you inherited practices from your foreparents. So for me, if it is that you are going to introduce someone to a new space, the livelihood activity that you're going to promote has to at least have some kind of spin-off from what they're used to. So for agriculture, one of the things that they promote as an alternative livelihood is going into agro-processing and value-added. As a fisher, you may transition from being an actual fisher to probably somebody who goes into the construction of nets or something, but I don't think you can move someone and expect them to adapt and take on a new livelihood activity that they have had no experience with. And again, we spoke about the issue of biodiversity and conservation. So the Red Plus initiatives, which is the reducing emissions through diversification and disaster and deforestation, is one of the initiatives that the Forestry Department is now embarking on. So they're looking at how Red Plus and the whole mechanism surrounding that can help communities and institutions that depend on the forest. So we sell to persons who they use forest resources, particularly agroforestry, as their livelihood source, and Red Plus is a program that they're trying to institute to sort of utilize. So how do we get them to not cut down the trees and also still be able to rely on the forest as a useful livelihood?
Do you want to say anything? Okay, can I get another question? Tell us who you are and who you are directing the question to. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Emma Lewis. I'm a writer, and I would like to direct my question to Tanisha Stevenson. I heard Greta Thunberg today speaking to the US Congress, and a very key point that she made was the leaders need to listen to the scientists. And I'd like to ask whether this is true whether you believe this is true here in Jamaica and in the Caribbean, whether our leaders are actually listening to what scientists say. And this obviously applies to disaster preparedness and, sorry, I'm putting you on the spot, I know, but it's a question that keeps going around in my head because in the context of disaster preparedness, this is also very critical for our region.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a loaded question that I think we all know the answer to. Let me answer it this way. I think there's evidence that our leaders are listening. I think we see enough initiatives, for example, around energy, for example, around looking at coastal protection, looking at land use management, so some of the initiatives that we see happening. I see evidence, and waste management, which is important. I see evidence that there is some initiative and some movement. Is it optimal? No. We would all concede there's room for improvement. But I think in a Caribbean space and in a Jamaica space, I think we see some good signs that the leaders appreciate, the parliamentarians want to hear about what's going on with climate change. Prof. Taylor recently attended a G2K forum. It's all about climate change. So you see that initiative to have climate change incorporated. And so I think that is a good sign, and we hope there is more of this as we move forward.
Okay.
As one of those who would be categorized amongst the leaders, I would want to take a bite of that cherry, so to speak. But just to point out that because I've seen some indication and some signs, because the whole inclusion of climate change as a part of ministerial portfolios, which has date back to probably about 2012 thereabout, has been a positive development, and it has continued over administration, we have seen the efforts by the current administration in terms of the ban on the popular candle bags, plastic bags, as a part of the effort to deal with the environment. And I can tell you, you know, my very good friend and government senator, we working across the aisle, Senator Matthew Samuda, we just drafted a resolution that he's supposed to table in the Senate, which is going to see, which is calling for a special committee of Parliament to track and monitor issues relating to climate change and the environment. And that is a resolution once tabled, I can tell you, is going to get bipartisan support. And so we are seeing some initiatives that are taking place and to come that gives an indication that certainly in Jamaica, there are leaders who are listening. I don't know if the particular jurisdiction that you mentioned, the question came from today, if the leader of that country is listening to anybody but himself.
Okay. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I was thinking about the question that was just asked and the one before that. And I think one of the things we can do more is connect the dots. We're doing a study for the International Labour Organization on women's entrepreneurial development. So it's getting us to understand where the policies are and so on. I think in looking at adaptation, there are a lot of opportunities to look at MSMEs and resources that are there, financing, to actually look at adaptation in a very different way. I'm also tracking the conversation on ICTs, information communication and technologies. And technology allows us, in fact, to be able to work in very different ways. So whether we are displaced or what have you, if we can embrace and make it accessible and affordable to more people, it means that they'll be able to have jobs, they can sustain themselves and have a livelihood. So those are just two things that I just wanted to say. The green economy, the blue economy, looking at what resources we have in the sea, which we have untapped, not to exploit and destroy, but to use them creatively, right? These are things that we need to be making people more aware of as survival strategies as we adapt to climate change and to disasters.
Okay. Do we have another question? Our high schoolers, anything from you?
You're all going to register for gender courses now, right? You can do your masters and PhDs. In fact, we have PhDs in gender development in disasters as well.
Go for it.
Sorry, I do have another question, and not sure who I would address this to, perhaps our keynote speaker today. But I'm concerned about the issue of displacement in terms of why is this region so far behind in terms of putting together legislation to deal with displaced persons due to climate change. Sorry, is that another sort of loaded question, maybe? But you know, it puzzles me. Why is this not high on our priorities?
Well, I'm not really familiar enough with the region to provide you with a definitive answer. I just have a hypothesis which I would like to test. I think, well, if I'm looking at previous discussions about migration issues in the Caribbean, then it was a very security-driven agenda. Secure borders to stop drug trafficking, criminality, etc. That's a big program. So if I'm meeting government officials dealing with migration, it's very much that attitude to not let people in, and not so much to let people in or to decide which people should be let in. That's the first thing. The second thing is that I think for some time the issue of people not just being displaced within the country but beyond was still rather limited in terms of numbers. It was mainly internal displacement. And those who went to the United States during times when the doors were more open. But now the doors are closing to a very large extent, and this might not fundamentally change with a different administration, we don't know. That's one thing. And the second thing is with the increased intensity, particularly of hurricanes, you will have higher levels of distraction in a way that people really don't see any future in their own country and try to go away. And that's why I said it is a challenge, and we are. I would encourage Caribbean states and migration authorities to start to think about this, because people anyway will arrive at the borders, and then the question is, how should we react? So it's very much about preparedness, because again, you don't want to open all borders to everyone. It has to be managed, movements of people. But you only can manage movement of people if you have clear laws, if you have clear concepts, if you have clear ideas and notions. And I think that's a little bit the task. And this action plan of the Caribbean migration consultation that was agreed that it should be developed, we'll see how far it will get, is a good opportunity for a discussion among Caribbean states on what they think would be adequate, how far to go, how to approach it. Certainly there will be differences in approaches, differences in attitude from one country to another. What I've seen is not that it's, when it comes to these kind of issues, a very homogeneous region, but it's needed, this kind of dialogue. And the experiences 2017, now again, with the Bahamas, I think should be a sign and a signal to take these issues seriously. We were from the platform, we were co-organizing together with IOM and CMC earlier this year a consultation hosted by the government of Trinidad. And I was very encouraged by the kind of discussions we had there. And it was disaster management authorities, but also migration authorities. And I felt that there is really a willingness to start to discuss these kind of issues at the regional level. When I'm talking so much insisting on the regional level, what we have seen in other regions is regional levels are a good way to start discussions. Regional levels are a good way to start discussions, not immediately about, for instance, regional conventions or things like that, but really identifying what are good practices, what has worked. When the people from Dominica came to different countries, the people from Haiti came to different countries, what did not work, and then draw from these lessons of effective practices, but also problematic experiences, what could be kind of common guidelines, and again, in order to harmonize domestic policies and legislation. To me, this is a realistic approach. And we from the platform are supporting these kind of efforts, together with particularly IOM, the International Organization of Migration, and then also with disaster management organizations.
Okay, and we'll take the last question from Dr. Jones.
Question, just two very quick comments on this last question. So I think we're correct in that, generally speaking, the region doesn't have proactive plans around responding to disasters in general and displacement specifically. I would say, however, that there are some countries that probably stand out in terms of their preparedness. So Cuba, obviously, is an exception to that, although we still see from the statistics the significance or severity of the impact of disasters. To an extent, Belize and the Bahamas. From the research that I've done, their disaster risk reduction strategies or plans actually do mention displacement, when other countries there's like no mention of displacement at all. So there is, I guess, a small ray of hope in the sense that we have countries that are doing well that we could model. Cuba was very willing in that meeting that Prof. Kaelin mentioned to share the strategies that they've used with other countries in the region. And then just the last thing, which we kind of discussed today in the seminar led by Terry, is what we call the social construction of risk. And we've mentioned it a lot today in terms of the legacy of colonialism, but I want us to remember in the region, roughly 300 years of slavery, and then some countries' very recent independence experiences, some as recent as the 80s. So we went through this pattern of development that is not responsive to disasters necessarily or displacement. And I think what we need to think about is moving forward in a post-colonial era, if that exists, is how our governments actually proactively respond to these issues. So those are the two things that I wanted to mention.
Oh wow, Natalie, you have sparked some additional questions and comments. Okay, we'll take three more, the gentleman and the two ladies. Quick questions.
Hi, my name is Lance Scott. Just a quick observation. You mentioned earlier that Bahamas received about $11 billion from the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. How do you think such a mechanism can be diffused on the local level to impact farmers who are at risk to these extreme events, droughts and hurricanes and storms?
Anyone in particular?
Terry.
Was it Terry? Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know about the Bahamas having an agricultural sector. I remember one of the things that fascinated me when I worked with the Caribbean Conference of Churches and visited there is them being able to produce food in small pockets of land. And when I think of the devastation now, particularly in the Family Islands, when I think of the devastation now, it boggles the mind about how you rebuild, yeah? And therefore they're going to be dependent on food imports for a long time. The question is, what are they? They've always been, but how do they adapt to this new normal of category 5, which is not likely to, be infrequent? So those are some of the challenges. What are the alternatives for us in terms of food security?
Not necessarily specific to the Bahamas, but generally in the Caribbean. We understand that this insurance facility, it's a regional thing. But I'm asking, how can this regional mechanism be diffused to something very local that can directly affect small-scale persons?
Okay, my own opinion is that we need to have a more effective CARICOM forum. There are places like Guyana and Belize that have large pockets of land. If we can collaborate more, it means that we can have a better support system for survival as we move forward. That's just off the top of it,
And just to note that if you take a look, I think there are efforts coming out of, I think, CRFM, that's the Caribbean Regional Fisheries Mechanism, to start offering insurance at a local level for fisheries. And I think it's being piloted in St. Lucia. I'm not sure, but I'm seeing efforts to get the insurance available at the local level. perhaps as we watch that pilot, we can see how it could be expanded.
But I just want to say, because I think based on this insurance fund, I mean, there are certain specific conditionalities to it. And for example, if you are to get a drawdown from it, the hurricane have to be at a certain category before the country can get a benefit. That's why there have been challenges and issues with Jamaica, for example, benefiting from that fund previously. Now the hurricane hit Bahamas at a category 5.
5 plus.
And at the same time, I understand that the estimates from Bahamas was like $7 billion in terms of damage and counting, because they have not completed their assessment as yet. So, you know, I mean, they would fall based on the criteria of the fund to get assistance. But as to the diffusion now, to let it go reach the groups on the ground, that's a different thing. And I guess that is the challenge that we will have right across the Caribbean in terms of making these funds that we get from different funds, you know, to make sure that the people who matters really get it. We saw it happen in Haiti a couple of years ago when the earthquake hit that country, and up to now, you know, the people who should get the benefit really don't get it, but a lot of people have been enriched by it, you know. I'm sorry that I'm going to have to take my leave from you, but, you know, it was always my pleasure to be here. I've been at it from morning. Parliament, and then lecture, and then this presentation, and I have another engagement. So there's no rest for the righteous.
Thank you so much. Okay.
Hello. My name is Jean Beaumont, and I'm an educator. And in listening to the research studies that have been mentioned today, I heard about the Ridge to Reef project, working with older youth. But we all know that education has an impact in the home. And I'm thinking about younger children and how can they influence behavior change in the home as it relates to just waste management, because the waste management impacts the green and the blue. And I don't know if there are any studies that have addressed that, because there's such I'm seeing a critical need to do some studies with parents and communities, especially with young children, about managing waste. Any studies?
Yeah, I think that building awareness of children in particular and helping them to be agents of change. There are some initiatives, but I think we need to do a lot more. I know at the Shorter Teachers College, for example, train those teachers to put environmental education. We have a Children First, which is an NGO working with street and working children, which inculcates the same values, to change behaviors and make them, you know, the whole environment better. We have done beach cleanups with our students, the first year experience. We do a gender analysis of the garbage, by the way. So you can use that education to change behaviors working backwards, which is why I think the gendered approach. So you look at age, you look at sex, you look at what our roles and responsibilities are, and you can use innovative ways. Also for education, there have been songs that have been done, poems. I remember Amina Blackwood Meeks doing one many years ago. So there's a lot of resources, but we need to be able to connect the dots and to share that information more widely.
Okay, yeah.
Before I go into my question, Before I go into my question, I would just like to follow up on what the lady that came before me said, and just say that it would be good if you could do a follow-up seminar regarding waste management, and not just waste management, but knowing so that we have less landfills and so on, recycling waste, being more creative and innovative in our recycling of waste and so on. All right, so my question basically is, I remember something that was, I'm not sure, something that was said that I just wanted clarification, that the oil should be left to stay in the ground. So this is a totally neutral question, not advocating for mining. So I just wanted to know, there's another question I wanted to ask. I remember. Yeah, there's a what good is it in the ground? As I said, neutral question, just curiosity pertaining to what you said. I didn't even know that. So just curiosity, right? So what good is it left in the ground? And is there some scientific reason why it should be left in the ground? Is there also a way we could mine in an environmentally safe way? My other question is, these states that are going against their own, I guess you could call it pact, to uphold environmentally conscious business practices and, you know, could they be charged? Could they be, you know, charged for what they're doing, taken to court, and so on?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, the issue why we should leave, why fossil fuels should be left in the ground is very simple, because once we extract them and burn them, they cause climate change. So the fossil fuels have been the major cause of why we have global warming in the last 100 years, and every ton of oil or coal that we burn, we create more global warming. So the hurricanes will get worse and worse, the droughts will get worse, the floods will get worse. So there is no rationale at all to take it out of the ground. It has to be left there. If we're going to get anywhere near less than 2-degree warming, then we should not be burning any more fossil fuels. So they should all be left in the ground. That's a fact. We cannot meet the targets for getting a 2-degree maximum increase in global temperature if we burn more fossil fuels. So it's a fact. If we take it out of the ground and burn it, we kill ourselves. So as regards to your second question, countries that are still doing this is quite interesting, because some of the countries that want to extract oil and gas are also claiming money for adapting to climate change. So this is a paradox. You might call it cynicism. You might whatever. Of course, their governments will make the justification that they should be allowed to dig this out because they need to have this, as they would see it, wealth, because it's worth money, in order to help the development of their countries. But there are very few developing countries which have extracted fossil fuels which have benefited the poor people in their countries. Nigeria is probably the worst example. It's had oil now for 40 years or more. There are people in Nigeria who can't afford to buy petrol, and the environment has been devastated by the oil extraction industry. Burma is another one, and what this is sometimes called the resource curse. This is the curse that the governments of countries which have these wonderful sources of natural so-called wealth are amongst the worst governed countries in the world. And so there is not much hope. I think we can see the quality of government in Mozambique going down as they extract more oil. The quality of that government is becoming disastrous as the EULAC. And in Uganda, there is fighting over who gets the benefits from the oil. It's fueling civil war, etc., etc. So fossil fuels are bad for the entirety of humanity. And in poor countries where they're extracted, they do not seem to solve the problem of poverty.
Okay.
Could I just say?
Sure. Sure.
If we could just return to the educator with respect to small children and the efforts to bring small children into the response to a changing climate. I can't speak to studies, but I think what you're picking up is more initiatives identifying the importance of the youth. And as you said, their importance in influencing older individuals. And so you'll find an EU Government of Jamaica partnership that in the past created a number of resources for children that could inform the curriculum of children in primary schools. The more recent initiative I'm aware of is the Global Environmental Fund. They have a small grants program. And so in 7 schools in Clarendon, Kingston, and St. Andrew, they have a program to create gazebos that are solar powered and to plant gardens with endemic species so students can appreciate the importance of biodiversity and suggest bringing the climate change in terms of this is an approach to reducing greenhouse gases. You have a solar panel, an approach to adapting to climate change, planting the trees, and these are endemic species. So I think your point is being taken on more and more of the importance of the youth in the response.
Okay, so let's have a round of applause again for all of our panelists. Mr. Terry Cannon,
Dr. Leith Dunn, Senator Dr. Floyd Morris, who just left, Dr. Tanisha Stevenson, Ms.Jhannel Tomlinson, thank you very much. And to our keynote speaker, Professor Walter Kaelin, we say special thank you to you, and I'll call on Dr. Dietrich Jones to make a special presentation to our guest speaker.
So I'll be very quick because we just have a few more things before we invite you to refreshments. Professor Kaelin, on behalf of the Planning Committee and the university community, we'd like to thank you for taking the time to give this very important address. I think I speak on behalf of the audience when I say that they're very enlightened by what they heard this evening, and it gives us a lot of food for thought, a lot of things to think about in terms of how the region can move forward with its response to climate change and disaster. So thank you very much on behalf of the university, and I'd just like to hand this small token to you.
I thought my duties were over. And now I'd like to call on Dr. Arlene Bailey-Wedderburn to give the vote of thanks. Allison, sorry. I'm so sorry.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
It's my pleasure to thank the many individuals and organizations that played an integral role in making this event a success. Firstly, we would like to thank the EULAC Foundation, and in particular the European Union and the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs for their generous funding in support of today's address and roundtable. We also wish to thank the University of the West Indies, represented here by various departments and institutions, the Platform on Disaster Displacement, and the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. Perhaps today's event represents the start of future collaborations among these institutions in terms of continued teaching and research. And we look forward to seeing our visiting professors here again soon. A special thank you to the representatives who provided opening remarks, Professor Stefan Gift, PBC UE, Ambassador Marcia Gilbert Roberts, Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, Mr. Stefano Silly from the EU, and His Excellency Dr. Bernd von Monschau-Paul. Thank you. From Ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany. Thank you to our moderator, Dr. Natasha Mortley, for ably guiding us through this afternoon's and this evening's proceedings and for being an excellent timekeeper. Thank you to our keynote speaker, Professor Walter Kaelin, for reminding us that there is no such thing as a natural disaster and that there are other factors that influence disasters and displacement. Thank you for the insightful presentation. To our roundtable panelists, Mr. Terry Cannon, Dr. Leith Dunn, Senator Floyd Morris, Dr. Tanisha Stevenson, and Ms.Jhannel Tomlinson, thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise in relation to the various aspects of climate change. You were able to touch on a number of issues in a short amount of time and providing much food for thought. A special thank you and congratulations to Dr. Natalie Dietrich-Jones, Research Fellow in Salises, who conceptualized the event and worked tirelessly along with the Salises team and the planning committee to bring all the various partners and stakeholders together and to make this event a success and a reality. We would also like to thank the Faculty of Law for the use of the Executive Seminar Room, MITS for the technical support and recording the proceedings, and the caterer for the refreshment that we will be enjoying following the event. Last but by no means least, a big thank you to all of you. Thank you to the audience for your support of this event and for your participation in the question and answer segment. A big thank you to our signers. I enjoyed learning a new language today. Thank you.
Different ones, but that's the director. That's the best one. Yes.